Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, May 23rd, 20. Our friend Dmitry Orlov. Welcome back, Dmitry.
Hi. You're breaking up a little bit, but we'll give it a try.
Yeah. Dmitry, let's get started with what's going on in Ukraine and the situation with the Trump administration. They came into power promising, even before coming to power, that they're going to put an end to the conflict in Ukraine in 24 hours. And we have been witnessing that the Trump administration was somehow incapable. There is some sort of division within the administration. But Donald Trump himself was incapable of communicating in a proper way with Zelensky. And when you look at the current situation in Ukraine, in your opinion, what are the realistic endgame scenarios for the war in Ukraine?
First of all, I don't think Trump has much to do with it. It was the Biden administration and various parts of the U.S. government and the Senate that sent all those money on all those weapons to the Ukraine and basically controlled and managed the conflict. And Marco Rubio actually went on the record and said that it's a proxy war, that it's not a war between the Ukraine and Russia. It's a war between the United States and Russia. So, yes, if Trump actually had the power to do it, he could have ended that war rather simply by cutting off all aid to the Ukraine, by cutting off all intelligence, and by withdrawing all of the American special forces and all of the American officers and NATO officers, which Trump could do because NATO is US controlled. And then the war would have ended because after that, the Ukrainian army basically driving blindfolded and would have given up, would have surrendered, and the war would be over. He didn't do that, so the war continues.
Do you, in your opinion, what's going on between the United States and Russia is somehow optimistic, or you see Donald Trump with the latest phone call between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, he's just leaving the scene?
Oh, I think it's incredibly optimistic because under the Biden administration, Russia and the United States were not communicating. And these are two nuclear nations, although the US nuclear stockpile is really old and Russia is way ahead of it. But still, these are two nuclear nations that have to avoid conflict. They weren't doing that under Biden because nobody knew who the president was and nobody knew who to talk to, etc. So uh, the fact that Trump and Putin actually are talking also means that various other diplomats and military people are reestablishing connections. And that makes World War III or nuclear conflagration or what have you extremely unlikely. And that is definitely a positive development. Um, I don't think it has much to do with the Ukraine, though, because Trump doesn't care about the Ukraine and Putin does care about the Ukraine, but uh, not to the extent of discussing the issue with Americans who are either the enemy or not the enemy, and it's Americans to decide which they are. If they support the Ukraine, they are the enemy. If they do not support the Ukraine, they're not the enemy.
But do you think that the way that Russia has decided to somehow change its strategy because they were talking about they're not going to negotiate with Ukrainians directly. Then they have decided to talk with Ukrainians. Do you think that comes from the Trump's incapability of forcing or convincing Zelensky together with Europeans?
I think there was some pressure put on Zelensky, but that's kind of irrelevant because who is Zelensky? Who is he? He's not the president of Ukraine. He's nothing. So he's just some clown. But basically, the issue was that the Ukrainians refused to talk to the Russians. They even signed orders. Zelensky, while he was still the president, signed an order forbidding communication with the Russians. And now that he's no longer the president, he can't even rescind that order. The order stands. But these are Ukrainian orders, so who cares? It's not a real government anyway. They don't control anything. But the Russians were always willing to talk. There was never any moment when the Russians were not willing to have discussions. Um, and in fact, there was some low-level discussions about the exchange of prisoners that kept going on throughout this period. So I don't know what influence Trump had on the whole thing, but I think he did put some pressure on the Ukrainian side to show up for the discussions in Istanbul, for the meeting in Istanbul, was a farce. Um, uh, they brought a translator, a Ukrainian Russian translator, and of course they all spoke Russian because the Ukrainian delegation doesn't know how to speak Ukrainian. Um, and then the translator escaped, and the secretary escaped with him. They're no longer in Ukraine. They went to some other country, as Ukrainians these days do more and more often.
Dmitry, when you look at Ukraine today, you mentioned that Zelensky is not somehow running the show in Ukraine. Who's running the show? Is that the United Kingdom? Is a coalition between among the United Kingdom and Germany and France? Who's that? Because with the Biden administration, we thought that the Biden administration is driving the show, Anthony Blinken and all of those people in the administration. But right now, there is no Biden administration. It's the Trump administration. As you mentioned, Marco Rubio said that this is a proxy war. The first time that they have mentioned that, and they accepting that this war in Ukraine is not benefiting the United States. But who's running the show in Ukraine, in your opinion?
I don't have an opinion on that because nobody told me, and I have no way of finding out.
Yeah, and but can you understand who's making some sort of barriers for Donald Trump to convince Zelensky, maybe putting a lot of pressure, the way that makes Zelensky rethink about its strategy, or maybe negotiating, maybe finding a political settlement? Who's the barrier? Who's making the obstacles for the United States?
I really don't know. I think it's the entirety of what's left of the Ukrainian elite. They know that if the war is over, then they're basically out. They're out of luck because there's only one way the war is going to end, with the Ukraine capitulating to Russia. So they don't want peace because peace equals capitulation.
Yeah. The you think that with the situation that we're in Ukraine, and the way that Donald Trump somehow is, in my opinion, is feeling that he's not going to be able to convince Zelensky. That's why in his last phone call with Vladimir Putin, he mentioned that the two sides, the two parties should talk to each other to find some sort of solution. How do you think that somehow this sort of talks would continue forever? Because I don't see Zelensky being capable. As you mentioned, he's not even the official president of Ukraine, and nobody sees any sort of presidential election anytime soon. Who's gonna? And do you think he wants to get something with Russia?
I don't think it really matters, but what's really going on is that Trump wants out. Trump is in a big hurry. He has major financial crashes coming up in the United States, and the Ukraine is just basically getting underfoot. The Ukraine has to be out of the picture, but Trump is a proud man, and he doesn't want to tarnish his reputation by declaring defeat. This is a proxy war between the United States and Russia, with the Ukrainians being treated as cannon fodder, as brain damaged, drugged people being sent to die on the front line. And of course, that's not a successful strategy. Russia is going to win, Everybody who knows anything about military matters knows that Russia has essentially already won. It's a war of attrition, and there's nothing to stop it until the fighting ability of the Ukrainian military is completely gone, with NATO and the United States defeated, essentially. But Trump doesn't want to have that defeat on his record because he's a narcissistic, proud person. He wants victory. He doesn't want defeat. So he wants to somehow parlay this kind of cameo role as a peacemaker. You see, he wants to claim credit for making peace between um, between the Ukraine and Russia, forgetting that it's a war between the United States and Russia. So really, his peacemaking role should be limited to him butting out. Just basically not stop talking about the Ukraine, just ignore it and wait for it to go away. You know, that would be the best strategy for him, but he's not quite up to doing that yet.
Why is that? If we know that he really wanted it. What's making it difficult for him?
Because it's yet another American defeat. America lost Vietnam. America lost Iraq. America lost Afghanistan. America lost Syria to ISIS. And if America also loses the Ukraine, you know, that would be the biggest defeat so far, right in the center of Europe, making America look like the paper tiger it really is. And nobody will be afraid of America anymore. Nobody will be, it's already the case. The Houthis are just basically walking all over the Americans in what is that country? But anyway,
Yemen.
In Yemen, yes. So they're shooting at will at American vessels in the area, and so the U.S. military is turning out to be a joke. But Trump doesn't want that recognition to be particularly well reflected on his record. It's a question of pride for him.
Yeah. We know that the military-industrial complex of the United States has had a very important role in what's going on in Ukraine. And do you think that coming out of Ukraine, the outcome of Ukraine would be somehow beneficial to the United States, to the military-industrial complex of the United States, or they're losing their fame, they're losing their somehow the way that the people were thinking of them before the conflict in Ukraine started?
Well, it's really the incredible shrinking military that the United States has. If you look at what they were able to send to the front in the Ukraine, all of that stuff gets destroyed and burns really well and doesn't give any huge advantage to the Ukrainians. The Russian military is now much better equipped and has much better strategies, which is why it's winning continuously. And what it's turning out as is the recognition that the U.S. military is really good at making very impressive, complicated boondoggles that are impressive during training exercises, but they can't fight a war. As a concrete example, they gave some Abrams tanks to the Ukrainians. And for a while there, the Russians were having lots of fun blowing up Abrams tanks because every time they blew up a tank, they would get like 1 million rubles as a bonus. But that sort of the novelty wore off. So now they're just kind of like, you know, oh, another Abrams tank, let's blow it up. And then the Americans kind of chimed in and said, well, they're not using Abrams tanks correctly because we're supposed to deploy Abrams tanks with air support and infantry support. So imagine the Ukrainians deploying an Abrams tank with with air support that the Russians would shoot out of the sky because they have complete air superiority in the region, and infantry support, which would be blown up by cluster munitions before they actually get to the battlefield. So then you would again have a naked Abrams tank that the Russians would blow up using a drone, and that would be the end. So the point is that the Americans really have nothing. They have nothing against Russia. Russia has won the arms race. And that's the bad news for America. Good news for America is that America is on another continent, and the Russians are not going over there to fight them, ever. So the Americans should just pack up their toys and go home and forget that Russia exists.
How about Europe? And it seems that right now, with the latest uh, events in Ukraine, even with the phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, they're somehow in some sort of panic. They don't know what Donald Trump would do in the near future if Donald Trump leaves the scene. And just Marco Rubio recently said if they want to send weapons to Ukraine, they can buy it from us and send it. We're not gonna, in a long run, we're not gonna send weapons to Ukraine. Do you see Europe as somehow uh, changing, or they're gonna double down on what's going on in Ukraine?
It really doesn't whether they change or double down on or take a flying leap and land on their heads. Militarily speaking, all of NATO with the United States taken out is a complete joke. NATO cannot function without US command and US support and US logistics and US software and US everything. They are basically just stuck. So if the US isn't running the show, nobody is. And it's just a bunch of useless demonstration projects. That's what the entire European part of NATO adds up to. Now, they're not even part of the picture. That's the important thing to realize. Putin, during a recent conference call with his used a particular word to describe the Europeans, a Russian word, pridurki. That means it's pretty close to idiots, but it's really something you apply very derogatively to people you don't really take seriously at all. So who should the Russians take seriously in Europe? There is nobody, and that that particular troika of Merz and Macron and that British empty-headed guy. I don't even bother remembering their names. They don't matter to that extent. What do they matter? They're just gadflies. They try meddling in this in this Ukrainian crisis. It's nothing. They have all these get-togethers where they kiss each other and hug each other and decide absolutely nothing, and have dinner at public expense. They're not actually achieving anything at all. And furthermore, because of all of those sanctions, which they think are on Russia, but are actually on Europe, destroying the European economy, they're wrecking their own economies and won't add up to much in the future. So they're not something to worry about. Europe is not something Russia is worried about.
Yeah, what they're achieving, in my opinion, is the continuation of the conflict and killing more Ukrainians on the battlefield. And this is the outcome for Europe. I don't know how can they be happy with this outcome. As you've mentioned, do you feel that the new Chancellor of Germany, Merz, is even worse than Olaf Scholz?
Well, he's a banker, so he doesn't anything except money. His statements about giving the Taurus cruise missile to the Ukraine. Anybody who knows anything about military matters knows just how ridiculous an idea it is, because the Ukrainians do not have any planes that can launch those missiles. None. Zero. So what good is that? And he can't even get that simple idea through his head that you have to have a launch vehicle. So how stupid is he after that? I know he's sort of the Bundeskanzler of sort of Germany, but that's just too silly to process. Um, so what will those people have to do with perpetuating the conflict? I don't know. They don't have any weapons to give to the Ukraine, to the Ukrainians. The weapons that Biden allocated, uh, those shipments will be done in a month or. And after that, I guess it's time for the Ukrainians to capitulate. As far as dead Ukrainians being shipped to the front and trying to shoot at Russians and getting killed in the process, who cares about that? The Europeans don't care about the Ukrainians. That's clear because that's been part of the whole strategy. The Ukrainians are cannon fodder. Um, and the Russians used to care about the Ukrainians, but that was before the Kursk invasion, during which it turned out that the Ukrainian troops have committed a huge number of atrocities, so that the Russians now treat the Ukrainian military. Oh, and add to that the continuous terrorist strike attempts on Russia by the Ukrainian military. So now the Russians treat the Ukrainians as terrorists. And terrorists, according to Russian military doctrine, are not combatants in the Geneva Convention sense. They're just somebody to kill. So that's what the Russians are doing. And for the Russians, another day, another 1,000 dead Ukrainians is a positive at this point.
Dmitry, do you feel that if something happens in Ukraine and they decide to go after some sort of presidential election, is there anybody in Ukraine to give some sort of hope for the future of Ukraine together with Russia?
No, that train has left the station. No use running after it. I think the best result was Ukrainian civil war, that they basically stop sending troops to the front, allow the Russians to occupy the rest of the now Russian regions that the Ukrainians are currently occupying. And the Russians would probably not immediately take over the entire Ukrainian territory, except for maybe a 100-kilometer buffer zone all around, just to make sure that drones don't get through and there's a defensive boundary. But beyond that, I think the Ukraine would be left to sort of ferment in its own juices, which means a civil war, which means that some of the Ukrainians who have been zombified would actually wake up and go after their own corrupt, criminal, terrorist elites and kill a whole bunch of them, and the rest would flee. And then good things could start happening to the Ukraine and the healing could begin. But basically, the entire political class that is currently in the Ukraine would have to either die or leave before any kind of a healing process with Russia could begin.
Yeah. If we assume that Donald Trump and his administration and the way they were trying to do something in Ukraine and they were not capable of doing it, it's somehow just reducing the aid to Ukraine, and then maybe the only solution for Ukraine, for the conflict in Ukraine, would be a collapse on the battlefield, and the Ukrainian army just not capable of fighting anymore. That's why that would put a lot of pressure, tremendous pressure, not only on Zelensky and his administration, but on Europeans, because they have to decide they're gonna send their troops to Ukraine to fight Russia. They're gonna they're gonna find some sort of solution in Ukraine by just ignoring the need of Ukrainian army, because Ukrainian army right now, everybody knows that they're not in a good position. They're not. The situation is just getting worse as time goes by. How do you see? Do you, in your opinion, the only solution would be a collapse on the battlefield?
No, the Ukrainians could capitulate. That would be good too. Unconditional surrender would be a very good move for them. I think at some point that will happen anyway. As far as Europeans sending troops there, nobody wants to do that. They're all talk and no action. The French kept talking about sending troops and then no, maybe not. And the British maybe would send some ridiculously small number of troops, but then they changed their minds too. Um, and if they did, I think the sight of lots of Europeans coming home in body bags would sort of maybe stir some memories. I mean, right now you have a lot of Germans thinking that maybe it's time to have a war with Russia. So those Germans are out of their minds. 80 years ago, Germany got completely thrashed by the Russians. How could they have forgotten that lesson? And do they need a reminder? Because Russia can give them a reminder. So maybe some Germans coming home in body bags would stir their memories and remind them that they're a defeated nation once and for all, that they shouldn't bother Russia ever again. That would be a very good result. Not sending European troops to the Ukraine would just be mindless slaughter.
And in terms of Dmitry, in terms of Europe, and we know that Orban together with Fico, they were making a lot of points on the conflict in Ukraine. They were not in line with what's going on with the western part of Europe, with Germany, France, and mm, uh, the United Kingdom. How do you see it? Do you see their position is getting stronger under the Trump administration, or it didn't make any sort of change in Europe? It didn't
Well,
make.
that's like comparing an elephant to a bunch of ants. I mean, who are these people? They're heads for now of tiny East European nations that don't matter to the United States at all. In fact, most Americans don't know who they are or what their nations are. Slovenia and Slovakia, lots of people backwards, um, even if they remember that they exist. Um, they're they're part of the European Union, and they're not a happy part of the European Union. In fact, they're probably going to be deprived of their right to vote within the European Union because they don't agree with European values or some nonsense like that. So they don't really matter. They don't matter.
Who's mattered the most in Europe for the United States right now? Is Donald Trump interested in Europe anymore, or they're somehow trying to pivot from Europe to Asia?
Well, he's talking about pivoting from Europe to Asia, but he's really talking about pivoting from Europe to America or to nowhere, whichever you want. The idea he keeps talking about, oh well, we can't spend our time on Europe because we have to prepare to go to war with China. That's completely ridiculous. There will be no war between China and the United States because the United States is not capable of fighting any sort of military conflict without Chinese spare parts. The moment Chinese shipments to the United States stop is the moment the United States military machine stops operating. For various silly reasons, the United States is completely dependent on China for all sorts of manufactured products that the Americans have forgotten how to make themselves. There will be no war between the United States and China. They're talking about pulling out of Europe. And yes, they need to pull out of Europe, but they're not going anywhere except home.
If if they do that, if they withdraw from Europe, that would do you think that would help the relationship between Europeans? Mostly, you mentioned the Eastern Europeans. We know that they don't have any sort of substantial problems with Russia, but the western part of Europe, is that going to be a game changer in the relationship between Europe and Russia?
Well, Russia has no use for Europe, except for the people who want to emigrate to Russia. There's a steady stream of them, and it's going to become a flood. There are lots of people who want to leave the United States, leave the European Union, the wreck that it is, and move to Russia, where there are lots of opportunities, economic opportunities, cultural opportunities, a good education for their children. It's just a sane country compared to the insanity that's going on in Western Europe. Um, but other than that, Russia has no use for Western Europe, none at all. It doesn't see it as a future trading partner because European economies are all shrinking in real terms. Politically, it's just a mess that Russia doesn't want to deal with. What Russia wants to do is bilateral relations with certain European countries, Italy, Greece. Uh, that's traditional Russian relationships. Hungary, Slovakia, uh, maybe even Germany in the future, is provided there's some sort of understanding that there isn't going to be any more wars between Russia and Germany, which Germans are, they seem to have trouble processing that fact. But maybe Russia will have a good relationship with East Germany when once Germany is deunified again. Um, who knows? But Europe doesn't really matter for Russia. A lot of European politicians think that Russia is going to attack them. What on earth for? Why would Russia want any of that mess? And what the United States pulling out of Europe means is that European wars boom. For the past 80 years, because of the American presence in Europe and the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe, there weren't any wars there. Well, as soon as the Soviet Union fell apart, there was a war in the Balkans. That happened almost immediately. But NATO was still sort of in control of everything, the entire Western European subcontinent. So there were no wars there. But the prediction is that as soon as Americans pull out of Europe, European wars will resume. You have to remember that England and France had been at war for 200 years of their history. How many wars between Germany and France have there been? There are lots of border issues that lots of people will be trying to sort out. Is Catalonia going to be part of Spain? Who knows? Maybe the Basques will want their independence too. So all of these countries that now have Muslim enclaves, that now have separatist sentiments in various regions. There will be lots of little conflicts in Europe, and they will have nothing to do with Russia.
I I think the point you're raising is so much important because it seems that one of the reasons of this panic in Europe is they don't know that how to deal with their problems. They need the United States to manage the things in Europe. They didn't come to somehow solve the problems within the European countries or continent. How do you think that? I don't believe that it's all about the war in Ukraine. It's something bigger of what's going on in Europe and the way that they're somehow fearing the United States live in Europe. What that fear, in your opinion, what are the main roots of that fear? It's something, as you've mentioned, the old and historic conflicts that they have, or something beyond that?
Well, it's sort of like a kindergarten class, and the teacher just quit. So the kindergartners are very upset because they don't know how to do anything. You know, they they don't know how to empty their potties into the toilet. They haven't been taught how to do that yet. So they're very distressed. Understand that all of the people that are nominally in charge in Europe are these poodles, like Macron, he's a former banker, like Merz, he's a former banker, like Starmer is his name. He's basically some party functionary. He never operated anything real in his life, and he's actually a little bit better than the previous disasters that the Britons produced, their party system produced. But all of these people are incapable of running anything, and so with Americans leaving, they know that their careers are over, and they know that they're going to be replaced with more capable people, if such people are to be found, and their careers will be over. The entire European elite is going to be sort of washed out to sea. It'll disappear. And of course, they're afraid of that. They're terrified. So they want to do something strong and decisive and militaristic sounding. We're preparing for Russia to attack. That's a good ploy. Of course, Russia won't attack. Russia will have nothing to do with them. But that's like a good ploy to make them sound and to be reckoned with, and etc. And in fact, they're just a bunch of clowns. They are, as Putin put it, pridurki, idiots.
You mentioned Germany and the way you see Germany maybe in the future can uh, improve its relationship with Russia. Do you think that AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, would be in that position?
AfD is interesting as an opposition party, but it doesn't fit into the fake democratic framework, the party framework that Germany has been forced into. So that the entire system rejects it, and it's also very East German. So it'll probably end up running East Germany, and the best outcome I see is that East Germany will secede and will reestablish its links with Russia, and will, after that, live happily ever after. Whereas West Germany can then fission into a bunch of separate lands, Länder, and live unhappily ever after, remembering that episodes of German national unity have been very rare throughout German history.
Recently, Dmitry, we had the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that the sanctions, he was threatening Russia with new sanctions and intensifying the sanctions. He said that the Biden administration was not capable of putting strong sanctions on Russia, or somehow the sanctions were weak and ineffective. When you look at the military industrial complex of Russia today, the capacity they have under the sanctions, tremendous sanctions, not just about the Biden administration, goes back to Obama administration, then the Trump administration 1.0, the Biden administration, right now Trump 2.0. Are they going to learn from what has happened so far, and how did the sanction work for the military industrial complex of Russia?
Well, those two things are not related. Sanctions have nothing to do with Russian military industrial complex, because it is the Russian military industrial complex cannot use any imported parts or products or materials. It is not legal for it to do so. So you can impose all the sanctions you want on Russia, and its military industrial complex will be completely unaffected, as has been the case. So Russia is out manufacturing all of Europe and all of the United States in terms of weapons production, and has not noticed the effect of any sanctions, because there is no effect. In terms of the effect of the sanctions on the Russian economy as a whole, it has been wonderful. So on behalf of all of the Russians, I would like to thank our quote unquote partners for all of the wonderful sanctions that have produced really excellent economic results for Russia, steady growth between 4 and 5% a year. The Russian ruble is now the strongest currency in the world and paying the most interest, by the way. And generally, the Russian economy is just blossoming because of those sanctions, because now the Russians are not being outcompeted by foreign manufacturers. They do it all themselves. There's full employment and actually a labor shortage, and everything is wonderful. So more sanctions, please. In terms of um, this idiotic idea of putting pressure on Putin, I think that's the way they put it, by proposing more sanctions on Russia. Well, there's a saying for that: trying to frighten a hedgehog with your bare ass. That's basically what it is. It will have no effect whatsoever, and it'll just make the Russians smile. So if you're trying to make Russians smile, just impose more sanctions. The sanctions are much worse for Europe and the United States, and have negligible negative effects on Russia. The other thing is that the sanctions technically don't work. If the Russians want to import something that is under sanctions, they will just go ahead and do it through Kazakhstan or through Turkey or through China. And there are lots of countries around the world that care more about their trade with Russia than their trade with the United States at this point. I can't hear you. You froze.
Dmitry, what's going
Okay,
on
I
with,
can hear you.
yeah, I'm back. What's going on with BRICS right now? How do you see this situation within BRICS and the conflict? We have two conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East. How is it influencing the unity or somehow the relationship of the countries within BRICS?
I think BRICS is doing absolutely fine. It's not a bloc, it's a military alliance. These countries have their national interests, and they communicate with each other diplomatically and make bilateral trading arrangements. They don't touch on military issues. So these things are disjoint. The war in the Ukraine or whatever's happening in the Middle East doesn't affect BRICS. BRICS is basically, you have to understand what BRICS is. It's not an alliance. It's just a club. It's a diplomatic club of countries that want to pursue bilateral relations with each other and are willing to discuss frameworks for exchanging financial messages, for instance. That's been going really well. Various other initiatives of that sort, like BRICS Bank financing development projects. Again, they don't get into each other's politics, internal or international, that much. They're far more interested in diplomacy and commerce, and that's just fine. So these things are disjoint. They're not related.
And how do you see the relationship between Iran and Russia? Do you think that the new strategic deal we had not only between Iran and Russia, we had between Iran and Belarus just 2 days ago, a military agreement between the two parties. You see, not only it's not just about Iran and Russia. You see between Russia and China. We know that these countries are member of these countries as members of BRICS. You've mentioned that BRICS is not about the military, it's not about, but they fear from the West. They fear what's going on, what would happen to them if they don't come together. Your take on that?
Mm, I think that they have far more basic interests in terms of security. That is done not through BRICS but through SCO. Again, BRICS doesn't really get into military stuff. So SCO is the organization that Iran, China, and Russia, and various other countries in the region use as a venue to specifically address security concerns. So Russia and Iran and Belarus have uh, weapons development that they pursue together. They exchange information on that basis. The Iranians are quite far in their rocketry program and drone program. So the Shahed rockets, the Russians took them over, made them into Geranium 2s, and have been using them very successfully. Now Geranium 2s, powerful engine that is very useful. I don't know if Iran cooperated, but they certainly would like to see the results of that and apply them to their own drone development programs. Um, so there's a lot of cooperation on that level, weapons development, et cetera, and general security frameworks, air defense systems, et cetera.
Yeah. China and the main focus of Donald Trump. He's talking about, Dmitry, a golden dome. When you look at the Iron Dome of Israel, the way it worked for Israel, why does he need an Iron Dome? Is that all about the military industrial complex? Is that the fear coming from Russia and China? We know that they don't have any sort of plan. As you've mentioned about Europe, they don't have any plan to attack the United States. What's in it for them to attack the United States? What's the main conflict between Russia and China and the United States? But they're trying to make a golden dome, as Donald Trump was mentioning. The head of Pentagon was talking about it. You're taking that.
Well, it's not an iron dome, it's a gold dome because Trump has a gold fetish. Not a defense system, it's a huge handout. And if you look at the companies that are supposed to quote unquote work on this Golden Dome project, they're the companies that supported his election campaign. So it's payback time. In terms of what's going to come out of it, well, it's basically Star Wars 2. What were the results of Star Wars? None. Now, the problem is that there aren't too many people left in the United States who can do the sort of back of the envelope math that is required to prove to yourself that there is no possibility of developing such a defensive system, given what the Russians already have in terms of steerable hypersonic delivery systems. There's no way to shoot those down. It's just physically impossible. And so it's just a complete waste of money.
Dimitri, I know that we have some sort of problem with the StreamYard. Next time, we're not going to use StreamYard. I don't know what's going on with this, but we're going to use another platform uh, to do the interview. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure as always. And everybody's happy here. And you're back to the channel. And hope you the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye bye.